as a speaker, how warm and appreciative the welcome has been. I felt extremely well treated, particularly for Dave for shepherding this rather loosely formed idea of a presentation to something that I hope is going to be of value to you. So the way that I hope it's of value is that it isn't a startup. So let me just ask initially, how many of you would classify yourselves as being in a startup situation? So a little, some, but yeah, or maybe slightly past the startup. So that was somewhat what I was expecting. So what I've tried to do is kind of illustrate some of the challenges and some of the experiments we've tried in the context of Printchomp, but I think that they are generally applicable to any. For instance, lean startup can happen inside an organization just launching a project, and you can still use a lot of the same principles. Or even if you're just a new Agile team starting in Agile, there's still a lot of that will be of value here. And interestingly, one of my key messages, which we'll get to later, is how I've actually used some of these in my personal life, which I always think is a bonus, right? If you can take something away from a conference that isn't just in the workplace, but can actually help your family life, that's always a big plus. And there's one particular tool here that's been valuable to me. So I'm going to start by explaining a little bit about Printchomp. And just like Paul said, this isn't a pitch for my company, but I want to set some context so you can understand the situation that Printchomp was in. So some of the key takeaways that you'll get from that are building trust, applying lean startup, how we applied it and how well it applied and how well it didn't apply to us, how we applied Agile tools and practices, and finally, how we started our journey to building a learning organization. And we'll loop through these kind of 4 key themes throughout the session, and hopefully you'll pick some nuggets out of each one of these things. So our company is an online marketplace for printed goods. We started about 3 months ago. We launched 2 weeks ago at TechCrunch Disrupt, a conference in San Francisco, which is a whole other interesting story, which I call tech porn. Because, excuse me if I'm being using bad words, but the idea is that it's such a glitzy, networking, magicians and jugglers and people wearing spandex. It's just a bizarre situation, and I'm a real kind of honest to goodness, let's deliver some value. So it's kind of really interesting to be in this startup glitzy situation when I just want to build a product that is valuable to people and to me, and it makes me money. And serves some other interests which I have, which are building great teams and making lots of sense. But this is our website. We're basically a marketplace where if you want something printed, then you can go on our site, and then we'll provide a list of printers in your area, or rating or by time that might be able to service your job. So it's Maggie, right? Mm-hmm. Maggie, you're at Expedia?
Yeah.
So we're like the Expedia for printing. It's kind of a pretty good analogy, best analogy. So we don't do printing, we're just trying to connect people that need things printed to people that can provide that printing. Because you don't have that experience online right now with anything that's customized. You can when something has a barcode, but as soon as something is customized, it's actually quite difficult to get that Expedia-like experience. So that's what our company is about. We have a CEO and CTO, that's me. It's always horrible seeing pictures of yourself. And this is our team. So one of the interesting things is that we have 7 in our team. And of them, Yuri on the far right has quite a bit of Agile experience. Nobody else has any. Nobody on this team has any real lean startup experience. I'm somewhat familiar with it. I've read the books. I've talked to companies, but I had no real world experience with lean startups. So it was quite interesting to try to balance the learning and bringing in the practices that I either knew from experience or felt from my learnings would be valuable to, holy crap, we have to be ready for September 9th when we're San Francisco. So just this balance between pressure to deliver and good practice and building a learning environment. We had some awesome advisors. If anyone knows the guy on the right, I'm just really thrilled to have him on our board of advisors. And we have some other people are very, you may recognize some of these names, some very influential people, which is really great. So we've been able to draw some great advice from our advisors. Okay, so the first, Dave. We have, are you familiar with these tokens? Does everyone know about these? So if anybody stumps me or asks a really awesome probing question, then you can, you may receive one of these, which you can exchange for a book at the book line up front, which is really a great idea. So building trust was, in fact, one of the most important things that I thought we needed to do, because if we're going to introduce a lot of new practices or new ways of thinking, people are going to have some confidence to be able to move forward with it, but also feeling safe enough that they could share their concerns and we could figure out ways to make things work for everybody. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that we did to build trust and see if that would be of value to you. I'm always kind of fascinated because, you know, when you look at Agile practices and lean startup practices and lean practices, it's all really kind of concrete stuff. Like you're going to have a standard, you're going to have planning, you're going to be estimating a story point. You know, and the Agile Manifesto says people and interactions over processes and tools. Yet if you look for the books of, okay, if we're going to interact, but how do we interact? Like what are the tools that we have to interact with? There's not a lot of guidance out there. Now, definitely there are some really good books, but not nearly the weight. So I find that the way that people can build trust and work effectively as individuals and teams is somewhat underrepresented in the reference material or experiences of a lot of people. So here's some of the things that we did. First of all, we made work visible. Anyone use Trello? Yeah. So Trello, I was really surprised because I've always had challenges bringing in, challenges. It's always a bit of an obstacle for people when you're telling them you have to do work in a new way, where you have to have task board and burn down and story points. And a lot of these were all new concepts to most of the members of my team. But I said, you know what, we're just going to use a tool just to show what we're working on and where it's at. And you'll notice that this is nothing like the normal task board or Kanban board I would normally build. But this has evolved. This is like the 5th iteration of it, and it's nowhere near what I want from an Agile or Kanban perspective. But it's what we have evolved to for now. So for instance, people are pre-assigned work, and there's columns for our names. But what was really cool about it was it made our work visible, and people liked using Trello. I was really shocked. I've never had that. No one has ever come up to me and said, boy, I really like using that online task management tool. That's really, but people actually like using this tool, which to me was, okay, I don't care if it's missing story points on here or whip limits or anything else I'd like. If you're excited to keep track of your work, then that's a big plus for me. So a case of trying to use the tools not because they're technically the best tool, but use the tools because the team has some energy and interest in using that tool. And definitely there will be some things that we do. So for instance, what you don't see here is in this staging, it actually looks pretty good right now. We have nothing in the staging column. But there are times where we've had 15 or 20 items in there, and we couldn't push to production because of either bugs or incomplete features and so on. So I'm anticipating we're going to be continually revising this board, putting in whip limits, for example, will be one thing that we'll do. So the next thing is really about effective conversations. I mentioned there's not a lot of guidance with the Agile literature around how to have effective conversations. And what I experience most often in the workplace or in my work is that there are discussions. And a discussion is something you can be reminded that there are discussions going on because it sounds like percussion. So it's like, we should do this. Well, I think we should do this. Well, I hear your point, but this would be faster to market. Oh, but I think this would be easier for our team to do, or this would be less. So there's like, I hear your point, shh, and I trump that with my awesome idea, and nobody's truly listening or trying to engage. And what you really want are effective dialogue. And I'm going to give you an example of a dialogue that I had with my wife. So when I told her that I was really interested in joining this startup, the conversation went something. I'd been playing around with it for a while. I wasn't fully decided whether or not this was something I wanted to do, because I was approached by the CEO to be the technical co-founder. And dialogue, I decided I wanted to, at the time I come to the decision, I wanted to move ahead with this, but I wanted to have the conversation with my wife. So the conversation went like this. You know, honey, you got a few minutes? I said, yeah, okay. I just want to talk to you about Printchomp and what that's, what that's like for me and what I'm hoping for. And she said, okay. I said, well, one thing I'm really excited about, I've been an Agile coach for years, and one thing I really miss is building stuff. It's great to be coaching, or I do a bit of pair programming, and I can kind of be involved, but I don't really feel like in my career role I really have a chance to really build something valuable. I'm missing that. And she goes, oh, but wait, you work on those open source projects, and don't you do and you've done some of the, we have the users group where you do some coding and you do training. You get lots of coding. Yeah. And the other thing is that our CEO is just an awesome, I think, a very talented marketing sales guy, and I've been in 5 startups, and known from experience that I really want a great startup partner. And then she said, yeah, but how well do you know this guy? You've only known him for a few weeks. So I was trying to paint a kaleidoscope picture of what I wanted in this situation, and she kept interrupting me, right? It was a discussion, so it was a bit more protracted than I've just outlined. I said, honey, this conversation is not really working for me. I'm trying to paint this picture, and you keep interrupting me. And she goes, yeah, you know what? This conversation is not working for me either. And she walked out of the room. Quite an ineffective discussion that we had. So I'd just like you in your tables just to take a couple of minutes. Try to put yourself in my shoes. I hope I've given you enough context. And what would you do if your significant other had just said, we just had that conversation, what would you do? I'll give you just 2 minutes. Just maybe pick a partner beside you, or if you're 3, you can just do it together.
So what would you do after that?
The discussion probably goes something like that. It's a good example.
It is a good example. I don't know.
I think one of the problems is preconceptions. Because you've been married for a long time, you think you know yourself, and you trust that she knows you. So right away there's a preconception that she thinks one way and you think the other, and it doesn't match.
Yeah, especially when you're very established. Like, okay, this is what I want to do, and I don't really want your opinion.
The decision has been made.
Yeah.
I'm just informed.
Just telling you.
And both sides of the conversation for that one too.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think, one is that if you're really set on something, you have gaps in the information.
Yeah.
That would be key to understanding exactly your concept, whereas you have it clear in your mind, so it's right there. But the other person, the same with any conversation within a team as well. What's in your mind, if you're missing some key points, it's not the same picture.
Yeah. And I think you have to be willing to go back and say, what are we going to have the conversation about?
So see what the gaps are, what's missing their knowledge.
And make it open so that they can
Because usually
whatever it is, hopefully you're trying to interact with the conversation, and then when you've had a chance to kind of
gloss over because you're choosing to gloss over them. They're going
See the
to
barrels there. They won't notice it on purpose.
They know how to dig into this as well. What you're failing to tell me is
What are you trying to avoid?
Best case scenario is so we then just work.
that's the best case scenario. Okay.
Anybody care to share, give me some advice on how I should have handled that conversation? Any suggestions?
Trying to elicit or think about what your wife is afraid of, what her fears are, and then approach the next conversation from that angle. Like, I know you might be afraid of, or about these risks of getting into business with somebody I don't know, and the fact that it's the start and fail.
Right, nice.
Is that some of the things you're thinking about?
Yeah. So,
Well, no, that would be something you said.
yes.
We spoke a lot about getting the emotion out of it and then getting the facts on the table.
Okay.
Sure.
A bit more to, here's the situation, here's the impact, and what do we do next? Yeah. Nice.
And actively listening before actually talking.
Yes. Yeah.
We have a couple of suggestions. One is to buy her present.
Sorry? Sorry, I'm not catching.
Find a replacement.
Find a replacement. That was not one of the things I was saying.
Buy her diamond ring.
Oh, nice.
The other one is listen to her point of view.
Yes.
Maybe you overlook some of the cons
Yeah,
and then come to the
right.
compliment.
Nice. So I think you're definitely a more talented group than I was in terms of traversing this conversation. I wish I'd had you before I'd had that first conversation. I realized I actually had a tool that I should have been using, and it's been a really powerful tool for me, and it's called the pull conversation. And this is from a company named Juice that lives in Guelph, that operates out of Guelph, which is where I am in Ontario. And they have a simple model for having effective conversations, and I've used this a lot. And the reason why it's useful is there's a Printchomp context, but really this was a discussion with my wife. So this is a tool you can use with your significant other or with your children or colleagues. So the idea is that like what you were saying, I need to step into there. I need to understand her fears. Like, I was starting out saying, it's all about me. Here's what I'm going to get out of this, right? Not the context of this is a family. Like, my decision has a huge impact on her and my children. I stopped and said, you know what, I screwed up. It was all about me. I want to hear what's going on for you with this startup. And I heard lots of things that, I'm worried that we're going to have no income. We have 2 kids going to college. How are we going to afford that? I'm worried in a startup just going to consume all your time and you're not going to be present to be a good father and a good husband. These were deep, she had more, but these were significant impacts on her. And it was her fears and her reality was these were her concerns. And I just reflected them back to her. I said, okay, so I hear you saying, I hear you, and you're worried. And I was able to reflect it back. And that's an important part of this tool, is reflect it back so that they feel like you listened and understood. So we hear about active listening, but sometimes I don't really, I'm trying to give you a tool that will be a really good active listening. And then I kind of flipped it around. I said, okay, well, here's what's going on for me. And, and I asked her, so do you get where I'm coming from? And then finally we said, okay, well, how can we make sure that what I want out of this is going to be consistent or equally balanced with what you want. And we found that there were some things. So, for instance, we put a time box on it when we reevaluate the success of the business. That I made a commitment to make sure that I doubled my efforts to be a good father, a good husband, and so on. So we were able to find the solution that we both could live with. And this is a tool I use a lot in the workplace when there are conversations. And I find that if you can reach out to somebody first, before you start to throw your ideas on them, like really listen, reflect back, make sure that they feel deeply understood, then that opens the door for you then to say, okay, I hear you, here's what's going on for me. Incredibly powerful tool, and if there was one takeaway from this session, I would say, you know, it doesn't have to be this particular model, but this particular model has been really valuable for me in my personal life and in my business life. Okay, the next thing that I'm going to talk about is asking for help and receiving help. Sorry, asking for help and offering help. To me, coaching a lot of teams, these are magic words. When I hear a manager or a leader say, how can I help? Then I'm actually almost ready to say, my work here is done as an Agile coach. So I will go out of my way to find ways that I can ask for help, because it shows vulnerability. It shows that you're open as well to changing, or that you don't have all the answers, especially if you're a leader. So this is something that I've actively modeled and look for and encourage in your teams. Ask for and receive help. The very best teams I've worked with exhibit this all the time. Does anyone have that experience as well? Yeah. It's just magic words. When you hear, how can I help? Ding, 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 yoo-hoo. We're good to go. Okay, so that was about building trust. The next section I want to talk about is lean startup. Now I know that I've heard that there's been lots of lean startup activity and sessions here in Vancouver. Is lean startup? How many people would say that they understand lean startup? I'm just wondering how deep I could go here. So I'll explain a little bit about lean startup. As I said, I'm not an expert, but I do know some things about it. What I love about lean startup is, as an Agile coach, I've often come out, I've talked to venture capitalists before, and I said, why don't you invest in Agile companies? Oh, well, that's just the way that they execute. I don't care about the execute. I care about their vision and their management team, and if they have that covered, I'll just let them run with it, right? And it always struck me as being really odd that, my personal experience was to build great companies, you need to have, an Agile lean principles and practices in place, because where I've seen that work well, it's just been so much better than traditional companies. Why don't venture capitalists get it? And it really bothered me for years. And when I heard about lean startup, I was like, this is it. Because it's really applying everything that we hold dear, at least that I hold dear about lean and Agile, but it's applied to the whole business. So rather than just viewing your software activities as being software development, instead it's about how do we be successful as a business? What is the important thing for our business to build? So it's applying everything we love, but at a higher level in the business. So this is a very crude sketch of how lean startup works, where you have, and I'm sorry for the blurriness of that slide, but customer discovery, who are your customers? Validating them. How do you validate that these are truly going to be customers that would actually, let's say it's a commercial enterprise, are going to actually pay for your goods? How do you build new customers, and how do you scale your company? These are kind of the core underpinnings of lean startup. And my contention is that Agile practices and principles in the trenches are really great ways to build mechanisms within your organization to actually execute some of the lean startup. Now, there are some that need to be scaled and weighed down. So, for instance, in lean startup situations, you probably would not initially do a lot of, say, automated testing, because you might build something just to see if people will buy it, and you're just going to measure, are people actually clicking on that buy feature A button? And until they do, then you don't bother. You want to minimize your investment in that until you've validated that that's actually going to be viable for your business. Now, we could probably have a 3-day workshop on lean startup, so I realize that's a very broad brush. But one of the challenges, I was the only one that had any inkling of lean startup. So I really feel this is an effective way to build a business, but CEO has no experience with it. So it was really an interesting balancing act. And I suspect you have this in your teams where how do you dial up the learning part or the new practices part of it against, you know what, we got to deliver something in 3 weeks, right? So Lean Startup and Agile have been something I've been chipping away at in our organization rather than saying, stop, we need to be doing Lean Startup, stop, we need to be doing all of these Agile practices. That's also blurry. Thank you. That's better. And I don't care if you don't need to read the fine print there unless you want to know some of the inside of my business. But this lean canvas was a way of getting like all of the key information about your business on one sheet of paper. And it was a really valuable tool for me to understand our business. So what is the problem we're trying to solve? What is the solution that we're going to offer? What is our unique value proposition? Why can we do it better than anybody else, which is the unfair advantage? And then more traditional things that you would think about, which would be customer segments, channels, costs, and revenues. But the cool thing was, I was really hopeful that, wow, when people saw this chart, that they would say, wow, this is great, because it's the entire business distilled into one 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. It turned out nobody cared, which was kind of interesting to me. So it's one of those things where I started and there's no traction, so I said, okay, well, I believe that this would be really cool, but let's just set it aside because it's obviously not cranking people up. But one thing that did was activation flows. So this guy named Ash, I always trouble his name, Moria? Do you know how to say his name? Moria, there. Wrote a book called Running Lean. And he describes something in his book called key activation flows, which are the moment when someone signs up to when they have a gratifying experience. And the word gratifying is important. They should come back feeling, that was a great experience. I actually got some value out of that. It's not just a Facebook like or a tweet. It's like they got something valuable. And this turned out to be pretty valuable when we couched it with personas. So is anyone using personas? These have been magical for us. I've been really surprised. And we spent like about an hour doing them. So nowhere near what you can do. There's a whole user experience community that talks about personas. But instead of talking about the user or the customer, just give that person a name and put a story around them. So we created Diane the designer. I like to have alliterations in mind. So it's a Diane the designer or Adam the administrator or Sam the sales agent or whatever you want. But in this case it was Diane. We just painted a sketch of this is the type of person that we want. Now you could do a whole pile of deep research and really crystallize and making sure you got the right person in the right segment, et cetera, et cetera. But the value for me was just having a name and a face to the story. Now, a lot of our stories, I don't know if you've noticed any of them on the previous slide, they would have had Diane's name in them. Diane does this, Diane does that. And it just cuts through a lot of, what about a sophisticated customer? Or what about a recurring customer? Instead, we just talk about Diane. What does Diane want? And we're tapping into her pain points and her value points. And we try to use her name on all the stories. That's really a great, surprisingly simple but effective way to get people to really connect with the people that we're trying to deliver value to. And then we just created activation flows like this, where we describe it from where she starts to, this goes on and on, but basically a stepwise flow of her experience on our website. And it turned out to be a pretty good tracking tool because to track our doneness, all we would do is put little check marks when we felt that we had ticked that off. The ones with the stars we decided that like a 1-star feature was something that we needed, was really our MVP. And anything beyond that, if we wanted to capture, but we're not going to put it in our MVP is minimal viable product, right? We would put just 2 stars beside it. So these were all things that we kind of invented on the fly, and they just worked. So here we can see we're pretty good in terms of we can achieve this, but there are a few 2-star features there that we have, and a little blue star for a comment. And we put this all up on a wiki so that everybody can edit it, comment on it, and contribute to it in one way or another. The other thing that we started to do, we had a little less success with, was, but I think is really a powerful idea, is if you are going to introduce automated testing, introduce it through these key activation flows. So you're going to have your key, maybe just 2 or 3 stakeholders. Diane is our primary persona, but we have a couple of others as well. And then we make sure of their key activation flows. We're tracking where we are, but also now we can automate this particular flow. So we don't. So when we chose to do automated testing, I think we only had, in terms of end-to-end tests, I think we had less than half a dozen, and our automated tests were about 50. Okay, and you come to a guy, and I usually teach BDD and ATDD, and I'm used to writing thousands of hundreds or thousands of automated tests. But instead, we just focused on writing just a few that were the key activation flows, because we already know this was our key value proposition. Have you guys used activation flows?
No, I haven't. But the idea of choosing what to automate follows a similar pattern.
Yeah.
What are the things that our customers love to do and that we want to ensure they can do all the time? And so it's automating those.
Cool. So good. Rather than automating everything, it's a good criteria. Well, this is the one that we should automate because this is important to our business. The other thing that we tackled was something called cohort analysis, and I kind of struggle with this word because when I use it, people go, "What the heck does that mean?" So it's a bit of an academic term. But the idea is that you're just trying to track people through from they're coming to your site and they sign up, and through to actually purchasing something and referring on, which usually means they're tweeting about it or they're getting their friends to join or whatever. And these are called if you want to look this up, these are called the pirate metrics because it's AARRRR. And the really cool thing that I learned in doing this, when I first saw this, I said, okay, this makes sense because now I can visualize our business and you can see, when you go from a lot down to, there's only a subset that will go through each step. Sorry, I should have ahead. You can visualize through bar charts kind of where you are, and I thought, that sounds really powerful, but how would I build that? That sounds like really complicated. And I found out it wasn't. I found out it was surprisingly easy, and let me explain why. So if you're doing something like this where you sign up, someone's going to download your product, they're going to talk about it, and they're going to tell their friends. Each of these steps should already be kind of a key step in your flow. Like they're already in your system, right? So I found that when I actually went to measure these, that I already had all the data I needed. Almost. We had to add a few timestamps, but more or less, we already knew all of these key things. And we were able to measure it using our system. So I've been this is another area where people are used to using their Google Analytics, and you can actually do this with Google Analytics or other tools or spreadsheets. Instead, I'm striving this. We got to build this into our system. If this is important, we have a screen that says this is how our business is doing right now based on this cohort analysis. And we go with something like this where we have week to week to week to week. And it's a powerful tool because it each week is when that person first interacted with the system. So even if someone from the week 1 decides to purchase in week 4, that's actually still counted in week 1. So they get locked into one of those channels whenever they first entered your system. Does that make sense? So that you can actually see over time, from our first users to our later users, how are we doing? How have we improved in terms of getting to a higher percentage of purchases? And this is surprising. We have a dashboard in our system that looks exactly like this, and it took me like 2 hours to build it. It was like really simple because we already had all the data. And it's now just built in. So that was a real learning for me, was that this analysis was surprisingly easy to do. Not complicated. So, are you game for an exercise? I'm actually going to skip this exercise just because of the time. This is my first time giving this presentation, so I'm a little see how the topic goes. But this might be something you want to take home. Like, could you sketch the key activation flows in your system and check off the things that you can measure now? You might be surprised. So, when you're looking at sign up, download, like what are those key steps in your flow? Just check off which ones could you measure in your system right now. You might be surprised at how easy it would be to do this analysis right now. It's a great dashboard to show your team. It's not about delivering working stories. You know, it's not just about finishing stories. It's about delivering value. And this is a way you can actually all agree what your value is and measure it. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about what we did on the Agile front. This is just the manifesto. Everyone knows this, I presume. Here are the practices that we're currently doing. Pretty good about stand-ups. The team recently decided to go from daily to 3 days a week, which I thought was not a good idea. But and I think we now have evidence that we probably should go back to a week. But you can see a lot of it's minimal or ad hoc. So in terms of a lot of the technical practices, we're not doing a lot of it yet, and that's partly because people are new to the practices. And the other thing that was really, I think I might have been slightly crazy, is we're using a technology stack that was new to me and the team. I don't know what I was thinking. Actually, it was very intentional. So we're doing this on Ruby and Rails, and I knew nothing about Ruby and Rails. So we were also doubly challenged with learning this new technology. So I didn't want to invest a lot in these design techniques when I wasn't even sure how to do them well. So we wanted to get some programming experience and understanding how we worked before we started investing a lot in automated testing, for instance. We did some automated testing, but not near what I would normally do. The one that stood out for here was pair programming, and we did a lot of that. A lot. We really tried to do it. So it's kind of surprising, I thought, how little of Agile we're actually using. And I'm going to loop back on that. Because it's really about, to me, it was about pain relief. So what I tried to do is when something goes wrong, so I put in the minimal structure, which is we have a Trello board. Let's put a work up there, make it visible, and just try to move something every day. To, okay, we've actually had some production problems. Now we're talking about, well, why did that happen? Well, we have insufficient automated testing, so why don't we add some more automated testing? So everyone agrees that we need to add more automated testing. But it's not because Declan said so, or it's not because I read the Agile book, it's because we had some pain and we weren't able to get all the features that we wanted to deliver because we had to solve, we were in a support mode. So another key learning for me was putting in the minimum structure for your teams. So just put in the bare guardrails that you feel they need to be just successful, and then introduce new practices when you recognize that there's some pain that they felt, and the practice would help address that pain.
How do you elicit that pain, surface that pain?
Retrospectives, but some of it is really obvious, like our production support was really obvious in that case. But retrospectives, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later on. Did you have anything that you've used to surface the pain?
Retrospectives. And we're working closely together, talking, communication.
Lots of communication.
Co-location.
Which is, and that's another challenge we had because we chose to start, no one's drawing salary from our company right now, which is great because we keep our expenses low. The downside is that some people aren't able to be one regular 9 to 5 in the work, right? Everyone has an equity position in the company, but nobody's actually pulling wages. So some people have full-time jobs, and so it was we found it really challenging to get together a lot. Sometimes it's in evenings or weekends. That's why you do a lot of pairing. But it's hard to get the whole team together, which has been very frustrating for me. So this, I've been with big Agile transitions, and thou shalt do Scrum, and it just causes a lot of pain, and not good pain. Whereas this is good pain when something goes wrong and it's in their system. Let's get together and figure out how we can stop that pain. And then people are really doing something because they know, or they at least have some confidence that it's actually going to solve something that they care about, not just because the Agile Principles and Practices book says you should. Let's see. I had really hoped that this would be more interactive, but I'm going to skip through this exercise as well. But you know, it might be worthwhile, you know, as a retrospective topic, like ask teams, what was the pain that we're feeling right now? Like, what do we think our biggest pain is? And then then you could have a discussion about, well, which of the Agile tools would help address that pain? Maybe we should do more pair programming, maybe more automated tests, maybe our stand-ups need to be better, maybe our stories need to be written better, maybe we need more, whatever it is. But then just connect the pain with the practices that you think would address it. Learning. Learning was really a key part of what we had to do because we had to, you know, everyone's learning Agile and Lean Startup. We're all learning Ruby and Rails. We're learning about our product and our market. So tons of learning and trying to set the seeds to get people to be intentional about their learning. We're not just building stuff, we're actually trying to learn, which is a key part about Lean Startup is you're just trying to learn as much as you can about the business that you're in so you can make informed decisions. So one thing I did a ton of was pairing whenever I could. I actually got people that would be willing to teach me Ruby and Rails. And I just went down wherever they were, I just went to their office and said, look, I'll pair with you for a day. And I just went in their offices and worked on their software for as much as they would put up with me. And I offered some things in return. So I would facilitate a retrospective or do something else that would be valuable to them. I probably got way more out of it than they did, but maybe I'll find a way to return the karma at some point. But pairing turned out to be invaluable because, you know, at the same time I probably read 4 or 5 Ruby books. I watched the Rails casts. I was listening to podcasts on my driving. So I was just like saturating myself with it. Where I really got the most value was just sitting with somebody that knew what they were doing. And that was great. One friend of mine, Jason Chunky, paired with me for a week on our product. It was just awesome. We got in a lot of great stuff. So certainly pairing in a team, it's such a, how many people are having effective pairing on their teams right now? Good pair programming. A little bit. So it's one of those practices that I think is, from a social interaction perspective, one of the more difficult ones to get into organizations. So I've experienced that as well. That the more that you can find ways to do it, the better. I'm not going to give you advice on that right now. You talk to Dave. But really, really valuable. The model that I use in my mind to think about learning is this Satir change model, where, you know, and it's important to kind of share something like this, I think, with your team is, you know, some foreign element. In my case, it was launching a startup. In your case, it might be introducing some new practice or a new team member, but something new comes in, and your team performance is going to drop. So people need to be aware of it. You know, if you're going to do pairing or TDD, expect that results are going to go down, which is actually really hard in a startup because you're just trying to get to the next date and you really don't want to take drops in productivity. And you really want to get up to performing. So to do that, you're really going to have some new insight that's going to click in people and go, oh, now I get it. Right? And it's really difficult to, you can guide that learning if you're cognizant of tools and techniques or previous history, but people really need to internalize it for themselves. So it's actually fairly difficult to just jump right through that. Like, people do need to acclimatize to that new thing, which is why the learning, the changes that I put in have been relatively very incremental, rather than trying to put people into a deep chasm here of learning. Instead, it's more incremental. One thing I'm always struck by this diagram as well is it just looks like the forming, forming, norming, forming, storming, norming, performing. It's exactly the same curve. There's something deep about this kind of way of visualizing change. The other thing that I found to be really interesting is that introducing double loop learning. Is anyone familiar with double loop learning? We actually had a little bit about it at our last board meeting, but the idea is I find that sometimes retrospectives tend to be a little bit well, thankfully pragmatic, but often very much in the mechanical nature of what we're doing. Oh, if we had moved our stand-ups, or if we had, 3 more acceptance tests, or, it's very much, we're still doing things the same way, we're just kind of dialing up the knob a little bit, which is a good thing. But where the real deep learning comes in is when you're actually challenging people's assumptions about the way that they work. So, if you're introducing TDD as an example, you're not going to get buy-in with people if they're just going to kind of write a little bit more automated tests. To make it really effective, you have to be able to tap into, as a team, if we can describe our tests up front and do that well, then that's actually going to be a better way to build software. And the assumption is that their previous assumption was that testing works best after the fact, but there's a deeper assumption, a deeper challenge that's facing the team. So effective retrospectives tease out the assumptions that people have. Well, why do you think that? Why do you think that we're wasting our time doing tests up front? Because there's an assumption there. Letting that surface and challenging it is really what double loop learning is all about. That's why the deeper learning in the organization comes about, because otherwise you're just going to keep doing the same things, but a little bit better. We talked about retrospectives a fair bit, and how many people, I'm just interested in a fist of 5. So a 5 would mean is we have retrospectives and they are really powerful and effective for our teams. A 1 would be we do them once in a while, and 2, 3, 4, 5 would be in that scale. So just on 3, just think about it for a second. Think about on your team right now, how effective are your retrospectives? 1, 2, 3. So we've got 5, so it's a good one. Half. 4 1s, so 3s, 4, 2, 2, 2. So kind of a mixed bag. Right? Well, it's been my belief that having deep retrospectives is really the key. And someone once asked me, if there's only one Agile practice that you could follow, what would it be? And I would say it would be retrospectives, because technically, if you had effective retrospectives with double loop learning in them, given sufficient time, you would probably reverse engineer all of the effective Agile and lean practices that are out there. It might take you 10 years, but you would eventually get there, right? So, if you can do one thing, this is nothing to do with startup. Think about having really deep, intentional retrospectives that are meaningful and valuable to the team. Don't just have them just because you're supposed to have them because they're in the Scrum process, right? And the best tool that I've used for my retrospectives are from this book. And it's not a deep book, but it's a recipe book that really describes, if you're going to have, here are the 5 elements that you want in a retrospective. Chapters, is anyone using this book? A couple of people? Yeah, great, yeah. I use it all the time, and sometimes if I only have 10 minutes to prepare a retrospective, I can go to this book and go, oh yeah, that would be a good exercise, yes. Yes, yes, yes. And you can structure, if you just follow this outline, and each chapter has like 5 to 10 activities that you can do in each one of those, you can, with not a lot of effort, ratchet up the quality of the retrospective significantly. How many people would term themselves as being in a leadership role in a team, either because they're a Scrum Master, a project manager, or otherwise? Yeah, so fair number. So if you are, and you're not happy with your retrospectives as they stand, I encourage you, if you don't have this book, get this book, and really spend some time trying to make those retrospectives more effective and meaningful for your teams. And one little tip there is when you have actions from a retrospective, the biggest thing I found with retrospectives is there's an action from the last one and no one followed through, or it just floats. Like, just try to get to like 1 or 2 actions and follow up on them in the next one. Make sure that even if they're not done, that you at least acknowledge that they're not done and incorporate that in. If you just have a retrospective that's just open-ended and people just feel like it's a meeting with no results, then that is a real turn-off Pardon me? Yeah, it's fairly common. So just, try to limit it to, my advice would be, open up, just limit it to one, most 3 activities, and just track them. First point of order on the next one, maybe during the opening. Say, just, what happened, what have we done since the last one, based on our decisions in the previous previous retrospective. Okay, so I'm going to just wrap up with some key takeaways. Building trust in your teams. That pull conversation model, whether you apply it kind of, if you want to buy that book, it's a great resource. You can certainly find them on the net if you Google pull conversations. It's just a really effective model for having good conversations with people. And the weird part is, even if somebody knows that you're using the model, it still works. What drives my wife crazy is, oh, you're doing that pull thing on me again. Yeah. But so you don't have to hide it or anything. You can surface that you're using it, and it still works. Ask for it, offer help. A great way, especially if you're in a leadership position, to model that for your teams. Applying lean startup. I'm still a lean startup novice, but I found activation flows to be really valuable and useful, and using those as the key for automating. And baking the key metrics into our system to do a cohort analysis so we can use our system to measure our business results. Applying Agile. Introduce what you need to address the pain. I've been to so many failed transformations where we're trying to boil the ocean and introducing Scrum, programming, and I'm now becoming a much bigger believer in just making incremental change based on the pain that the teams feel. And I didn't talk too much about intention. I took on tons of technical debt, but it was intentional. So sometimes kind of an aha moment for me was, you tend to read about technical debt as being bad, but there are actually really good times where you intentionally decide, we're not going to do this the way that we would otherwise choose because of business reason X, Y, Z, or the team doesn't know how to do that yet, or whatever reasons. And if you're doing that and you're doing that intentionally, then I think that's a good thing. You may be wrong, but at least you're not running blind. So technical debt isn't always bad. And finally, learning, using pairing wherever you can, either within your organization or outside your organization. In my case, a lot of it was outside. Double loop learning. Really trying to focus on challenging people's assumptions about the way that we work, not just trying to tweak the way that we do little things a bit better, but really trying to get to the heart of how do we build good software. And finally, the big key one for me is always effective retrospectives. Invest in them, and you will be very happy with the results that you have. Solicit people's feedback on them. I usually always have a fist of 5 or play a perfection game at the end of my retrospectives. If you have an opportunity to say, you know what, I've had ratings of like 2 out of 5 on my retrospectives. And, oh, well, what would be better for you? At least you can invite that conversation instead of people just moaning about it. I've covered everything that I had hoped to cover. I'm sorry that we didn't get to do some of the exercises. I hope that this was of some utility to you, in that it's not just about startup. Most of the things that I've talked about here I feel are valuable in most contexts, particularly challenging in a startup because of the pressure to deliver. And also, I hope that there's a little bit there that you can actually take home with you, particularly around the full conversations. And I think we have that's it. And we got a couple of minutes. I don't know. Some questions. A couple of questions.
Questions? Yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned that many part-time employees that follow similar to our work scenario. We have many developers, but they keep getting interrupted. So we also consider them working part-time to our project. So how do you manage by using Agile tools and all that to meet the deadline and to accomplish the project at the end?
So the question is, with part-time people, how do you use Agile tools when you're not all together all the time? Was it more about being part-time or not being together?
Well, you can be together, but you only have a portion, like only a portion of your time can be dedicated to this project. And you also have a deadline, like you need to go to San Francisco to present your thing, right? But how do you make sure that they can get the thing done, and then you still can get them delivered with good enough quality at the end?
That's a good question. Well, I think I've covered a lot of what I am doing right now to do that, and the part-time bit is tough, but just maximizing the use of when they are part-time, pairing up so there's as much shared learning as possible across the team, whether it's from Emacs key shortcuts to deep information about the product. The other thing is try to be very intentional about making time to get together, to make sure that you get the whole team together in a retrospective or other situation where you're not just cranking the work. So definitely setting aside time for that and making sure that they're bought into it. But maybe we could talk some more, if we could get a chance, about some other things that we've tried to, at a high level, that's what I've done. Maybe you have something you could help me with.
So if you think that in retrospective, you will find out what's blocking them and then what can help them to get things done on time.
Yeah. And they're part-time, people are very nervous, but well, if I only have 20 hours a week or whatever it is, then they're a little reticent to spend a lot of that in retrospective, rather because they just feel the pressure to keep doing their job, doing what they otherwise think is their job, right? So that you have to be careful with that too. Getting the right amount. There's another question? Yes?
Do you have any advice for those items that repeatedly come up in retrospectives that are just really, really hard to change? Like there are certain natures in an organization, and they're coming up again and again in a retrospective, and you're in a leadership role, and you're trying to make these changes, but there's those ones that are always lingering. Do you recommend trying to tackle those and the team that they're challenging? That's when you're never able to really solve them. That's when I find the retrospective starting to go down in value for the team.
I'll answer that really quickly. A couple of things that I've used that have been helpful. One of them is you can have a retrospective about what are the challenges and group them into 3 groups. Things that are within our control, things that we can influence, or things that are beyond our control. And then you can start to encourage the team, you know what, if that's beyond our control, then we're just wasting that's just the context we're in. It's not valuable to us or anyone else to be complaining about that because that's outside our control. If it's in your influence and you could take some action probably as a leader to try to influence upwards and outwards, and then, but really having the team focus on what things are in our control. So making that explicit can be helpful. And I think the other thing would be making those things visible. So for instance, Henrik Nyberg had a great story about, do you want to take in 1 minute and I'll just tell you this story, which is pretty cool. He went into it, Henrik Nyberg is an Agile coach with Chris Software in Sweden. He told me a story about, he was working with a team and they were going through an Agile transformation, and they had about 5 or 6 retrospectives, and he'd come in and facilitated them. And usually it was, we're having trouble with pair programming. It was kind of the very normal or very understandable challenges the team were having. And finally, they got to one retrospective and they said, our management doesn't value us. That's really the biggest concern. Right? We do not feel valued. So what he did was he just said, oh, that's interesting. So he just put it up on their whiteboard. And then as he was leaving, because he was just a coach that was helping them at key touch points, he brought over the CEO, key leader, and said, you might want to pay attention to this. And he said, well, what do I do? These people feel undervalued. He said, well, I don't know. But he just left it up. And then what happened was just making it visible. So making that pain that the team feels about something that's outside their control was sufficient that then people would walk by and go, oh, what's this? Teams feel undervalued. All of a sudden, some conversations started to happen with the management and executive level, and then they actually got the managers then, well, why do you want to have, they actually facilitated those conversations. So I guess in summary, what I'm trying to say is make it visible. Things that you can't control, at least make them visible to people that can do something about it. And make it highly visible.
That's cool. An interesting one. I'm curious, I'll sleep on it.
I think we're done. Thank you for
I'd like to take a moment just to thank Declan again. You already know about curiosity. So thank you very much for a very entertaining talk. Thanks a lot, Declan.
Thank you.